For more, we've reached Kamran Bokhari. He's a senior director at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy in Washington. He's in Purcellville, Virginia. Good morning, Kamran. Lots to talk about here. Trump says Iran called to negotiate, but saying that his administration also weighing political military intervention and that Iran is close to crossing his red line. Do you think that Iran wants to negotiate, as Trump says, and what would that negotiation look like?
Thank you for having me. Look, there's no sort of doubt in my mind that there's no other way for the Iranian regime but to negotiate. If you look at it simply and you zoom out of all the details of what's happening, they have nationwide public unrest, and their economic situation is very bad. They need to do a deal with the United States, some sort of an understanding and accommodation, and that would allow them to alleviate the pressures at home. There's just no way around that. So yes, they're going to make statements and they're going to threaten, but at the end of the day, this is why they are reaching out. And I would say that this is sort of maybe through official channels, but the back channels don't go silent at all. And we've seen this even through the war back in June of last year. So I think that there is going to be a negotiation, but it's tricky because we don't know what the situation on the street is and how vulnerable the regime is. And this is something that the president and his team are closely monitoring.
You know, Iran has also issued warnings, as you suggested, that U.S. military and commercial bases would be treated as targets if the U.S. decided to intervene. Do they have time to negotiate? I mean, we're talking about an unpredictable president of the United States, a growing protest movement there, deaths rising. What would it take for the U.S. to actually intervene, and what would be the consequences of that?
I think that the intervention has to be really unpacked. I mean, we know that there is no appetite for a large-scale military operation. What we've seen in the past are surgical precision strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities on the part of the United States, and then airstrikes by Israel. So I doubt that anybody is making a plan to go in and do anything more than that. We should also look at what the president, how the president approached the Maduro regime. The regime is still there, but Maduro was removed. So does that mean that we're going to go and remove someone like the supreme leader of Iran? I don't think so. I think we shouldn't take that as a template for what may happen in Iran. But it'll be something similar where the regime will have to make some concessions. And then in exchange for those concessions, the United States will offer some concessions. But the trick is that how do you sort of balance it three-way, where the regime doesn't collapse and creates a power vacuum, and at the same time, you placate the masses, and it's in the American interest. So this is going to be a tough one.
Yeah. Do you think the regime is vulnerable at this time?
Well, it is very weak. Is it going to collapse tomorrow? I don't think so. But I wrote a piece for Forbes magazine yesterday saying that the issue isn't whether it's collapsing or surviving. It's not collapsing just yet, but it's not surviving. Something's got to give. So we're probably looking at, a slow-moving regime evolution change. This is something I predicted in a report from back in April of 2024, that there's already a process internally underway, and it centers on the transition to or succession to a new supreme leader. And so I think that is where we should focus on, because we've seen what happens when regimes collapse, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya and other places, and it becomes a huge mess. I don't think that the Trump White House is interested in that. The question is, how can we come up with a formula that's good for the people of Iran, that does not create a strategic vacuum in the country with state collapse, and at the same time is in keeping with American interests?
I want to ask you a few quick things, Kamran. The foreign minister said today that Iran is not looking for war, but it's fully prepared for war. In fact, more than it was before the June attacks. Is that accurate?
Well, look, this is what you expect them to say. They're not going to throw in the towel. They're not going to say, well, we're weak and we will be, we're vulnerable. Of course, they're going to double down with their rhetoric and say, hey, we don't want to pick a fight, but we're ready if you want one. I mean, all sides in negotiations and whatnot act tough. So I think we should go beyond these statements. I mean, the foreign minister also said that we are now in full control of the situation. Well, if that's the case, then what's the whole uproar about? So we need to sort of take these statements with a heavy pinch of salt.
I asked you a moment ago if there's time to negotiate, because we're now seeing, 3 or 4 days of internet blackout. The foreign minister said, too, this morning that would end soon. We don't know if that's true. And, 3 weeks of protests, it seems like time is being whittled down before there's a strike point, really, here, one way or the other. What do you think? How long can the protests continue and the regime continue to tamp it down?
Well, I think the protests will likely continue, even if they taper off for now. There's enough angst in the nation that if something else goes bad, like the devaluation of the currency that sparked the latest wave, then you can see people back on the streets again. So there isn't a good solution for that. So that's one thing. Number two is, at what point does the United States feel that it has no choice but to actually act and conduct some airstrikes? And I don't think that the president wants to go there. But then again, I'm going based off of what he has said. He's basically said, look, we may have to do this, but we're ready to talk. So the question is, can they reach some sort of an understanding behind the scenes and then not have to go down that route? That's where we are, but it's a very fluid situation. Everything we've discussed may prove to be moot because a new situation emerged. As you said, it's a very dynamic situation.
And we'll come back to ask you about that if it does. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.